Hello, everybody. It's great to see everybody's faces. And I regret to ask you all that for the duration of the talk, before the roundtable discussion, I'm going to ask everybody to turn off their videos and mute their mics so that we give an optimal environment for the speaker that won't be distracting and that will be most supportive. It's wonderful to see all the people who've shown up today. So in a second, I think we need to let couple more people in. So mic's muted and video's out, and these rules will be repeated again once more. So I'm Maya Kóvskaya, and I'm the founder and director of the Multispecies Ecological Worldmaking Lab, AMOR MUNDI, and I'm going to introduce you to our moderator tonight. And also, I would like to thank our institutional hosts, which are RCSD and ICHI, the Regional Center for Social Science and Sustainable Development, and the Integrative Center for Humanities and Innovation at Chiang Mai University, where I teach. So let me introduce you to our moderator. Athong Makury hails from Nagaland. He is an ecological and indigenous activist and who does research on policy advocacy for the rights of indigenous people since 2012 at the national, regional, and international level on a variety of platforms. He's well known for defending human rights and the environment with a special focus on the indigenous communities across the Burmese context. Athong recently participated as an indigenous advocate at the Convention on Biological Diversity at the United Nations, can't talk tonight, Biodiversity Conference, COP15 in Montreal. He has also worked as an observer to the Indo-Naga-Burmese peace process from 2011 to 2020. And as part of this advocacy work for indigenous land rights, he's also directed videos on Nagaland. Significant publications include his 2018 book, Land and Forest Governance in the Naga Village Republic. And he also has an incredible linguistic array of capabilities. He has authored and published a 2013 Saramati Standard Dictionary, which is English, Makury, and Burmese, and also Makury orthography, Makury basic grammar, Makury reader's test, and then many indigenous storybooks. And he's even translated the Bible for his community from the original language, Hebrew and Koine Greek, which he has a degree in as his bachelor's in ancient languages. He speaks Makury English, Burmese, Nagamese, and many other vernacular languages, as well as conversational Hindi and Assamese. He's kind of a badass. He's also pursuing his master's in social sciences at Chiang Mai University in Thailand here, specializing in indigenous governance systems. And he is developing indigenous-led programming and research with us through the AMOR MUNDI lab. So I would like to hand the floor over to Athong. It's all yours.
Hello, everyone. Happy New Year. Thanks, Ajahn, for your wonderful introduction about me. Thanks to everyone who comes join this event, this talk, this evening, or like morning and afternoon for peoples from all around the world. So before we go into the talk, let me introduce about the lab and pronounce land acknowledgement. And of course, before we go on, let's remember the housekeeping rules, which Maya has just said about the mics and questions. If you want to give questions during this talk, maybe you can put it in the chat box. And of course, after the main speaker and roundtable discussion, we will have a question and answer session. So let me introduce the lab. AMOR MUNDI Multispecies Ecological Worldmaking Lab is an intersectional multidisciplinary research initiative in the Global South, investigating how human and modern human world making and survival are mutually entangled. Our aim is to grow a knowledge-making community by fostering dialogues and collaborations amongst the disciplines spanning eco-philosophy and ecological political theory, ethology, and ethology, animal, plant, and critical life studies, geography, anthropology, political and social sciences, humanities, art, and natural sciences through research, publications, workshops, curated conversations, art, science, exhibitions, multi-species ethnography, and innovative pedagogy. Let me also pronounce land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that this land on which we speak, work, and live belongs to all earthly beings, past, present, and future, including the many diverse indigenous peoples who came here and made homes long before there were nations or states. Acknowledgements are not enough. However, we need to actively begin decolonizing our relations with the natural world of which humans are part a part, returning stolen lands to traditional custodians who have proven their capability and will to preserve biodiversity and landscape integrity in the lands under their stewardship is a needed first step. Borrowing from the words of Park Young, decolonization, not a metaphor. So as we are going to start the talk, let me introduce the name of the talk. So today the talk is entitled How to Give Up. And we also have the headlining speaker, social thinker, Dougald Hine. Let me share about his bio to everyone here. We are really, privileged to have him today. Dougald Hine is a social thinker, writer, and speaker. After an early career as a BBC journalist, he co-founded organizations including the Dark Mountain Project and a school called Home. He has collaborated with scientists, artists, and activists, serving as the leader of artistic development at Rick Theatre. Sorry, Dougald, if I'm wrong, correct me. The Sweden's National Theatre, and as an associate of the Center for Environment and Development Studies at Uppsala University. At Work in the Ruins includes the work that began with co-authoring Uncivilization, the Dark Mountain Manifesto, published in 2009, which we also, of course, read recently in our readings. And his second book with Chelsea Green, following the anthology Walking on Lava, published in 2017. And also today, the talk is drawn from Dougald's forthcoming book, about which Amitav Ghosh, acclaimed author of The Great Derangement and The Nutmeg Curse, has written. At Work in the Ruins is one of the most perceptive and thought-provoking books, yet written about the multiple intersecting crises that are now upending our once familiar world. Of particular importance is Hine's deeply respectful yet unsparing analysis of the strengths and the limitations of science in reckoning with these crises. At Work in the Ruins is essential reading for these turbulent times. So now let's start a talk. So let me give the floor to Dougald. Time is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Athong. It's really good to be here. I'm going to start by making some trouble because I'd like to bend the rules a little. It would be really good for me to see your faces. So keep your microphones switched off, but if people are in a place to do so, then please switch on your cameras so I can see the people I'm speaking to. The other favor I'd like to ask is if we don't use the chat during the talk, because I find it really hard to give my attention fully to being with you and speaking to you if there are words popping up at the bottom of my screen. So I'm sure we'll put the chat to good use when we get to the roundtable. Thanks, everyone. It's good to see your faces. Good to be with you. Greetings from the dark north, further north than where I grew up in the northeast of England. I only looked this up the other day, but on the road that you come on by bus from Uppsala, our nearest city, to Östervåla, the little town where my family and I live, you cross the invisible line of 60 degrees north. So that gives you an idea of how far up the planet we are. Greetings from Sweden, which still half seriously sometimes refers to itself as the world's most modern country. After 10 years living here, I've begun to suspect that it might be the world's last modern country. Greetings from a library in a shoe shop that has become a school called home. And while we're doing these coordinates, greetings from the first days of January, which I think we might call the season of giving up, on account of all of those resolutions that people make at the turning of the year to give up this habit or that substance. Feels like an appropriate time to be coming together around this theme. And I hadn't thought of that when I suggested it to Maya and colleagues a couple of months ago. So that's a nice happenstance. It seems to me that those resolutions that are made at the turn of the year, it's not just an arbitrary point in time. Now, saying that, I know that there are many ways of reckoning years. And even in Northern Europe, if we were to go back to the Middle Ages, we would find that New Year was reckoned to be the 25th of March. So just after the spring equinox, rather than after the winter solstice. But it's striking to me that at least this far north on the planet, it seems to have made sense to people to tie that threshold to a moment just after one of the turning points in the solar year. And it seems to me that when people make decisions to give up something on the 1st of January, it's not just any old date, and it's not just about the calendar, it's also borrowing something from the momentum, the turning of the planetary cycles, which we are still a part of, and which, when you live this far north, still affect our lives quite a lot, even when we live with triple glazing and the seasons can often feel like a backdrop rather than a condition of the possibility of life, which of course they still are. So what I want to do today, drawing on this book, which is coming out 4 weeks today at work in the ruins, is to talk a little about giving up. I want to talk about some good and bad ways of giving up. I'm not an academic, so I can use language like that. But if it's a stumbling block to frame it in such a kind of crude moralistic way, maybe I could say some ways of giving up that might turn out to be wiser than others or more helpful than others. And part of what helped me pull all of this together as I was preparing for today is an email that landed on my inbox on the 1st of January from Extinction Rebellion, one of the climate movements that emerged from that moment in 2018, which is one of the seeds for the stories that I'm telling in the book. And on the 1st of January this year, they sent out a mail to all of their supporters which was headlined, "We Quit." And as you read down, the statement was, we're going to lay aside the kinds of direct action which we have been practicing and been associated with over the last few years. We're going to turn away from these interventions that are interrupting business as usual in public space in deliberately disruptive ways. And this year, what we're going to do is try and make our actions as welcoming to as many different people as possible who might not be in a position to put their bodies on the line and get arrested and all of the rest of the things which have been part of the practice of XR since 2018. And that headline, "We Quit," made a strong impression on me, partly because I think it resonated with something that, for me, has been there in the 2018 movements from the start. You know, one of my first glimpses of XR in the autumn of 2018 was a group of activists dropping banners off Westminster Bridge that just said, "Climate change, we're fucked." So you could say that, you know, this has been a moment of an activism where giving up is kind of the starting point, and then what do you do next? It had a very different flavor to it. All of the movements that emerged in that moment had a very different flavor to the last major wave of attention and activism around climate change, around sort of 2006, 7, 8. Because back then you had Al Gore with his PowerPoint, and it's kind of like he was walking you up to a viewing point about a quarter of a mile from the edge of the abyss and gesturing towards it and explaining it to you, and then walking you back down with a list of things we can do to make it all be okay. Al Gore didn't want you to panic. What was powerful about the voices of 2018-19 was the sense, the palpable sense that whether it was Greta Thunberg or Gail Bradbrook or actually even Jem Bendell with the Deep Adaptation paper, in different ways, they were all speaking from a point of hanging over the abyss themselves. None of them were promising you that there was anything we could do that would make all of this be okay. And that was part of what unlocked so much energy, I think, in that cultural moment of the beginnings of those movements. And that's one of the things that I'm writing about in the book. But for me personally, that headline, "We Quit," also had a very strong resonance because 15 years ago this year, I read a blog post by a guy called Paul Kingsnorth. And the title of the blog post was, "I Resign." And as a freelance journalist, if you've reached the end of your tether, if you've decided it's time to quit the trade that you've given your life to, you no longer believe it can achieve the things you thought it could when you went into it 15 years earlier, then where do you send your letter of resignation? Posting it on a blog seems like as good an answer as any. And so that's what Paul did. And then at the very end of it, he said, "But I have this idea for a new publication that would be different to anything I've been part of." And he described it in a few lines, and he said, "And if this is going to happen, I'm going to need people who want to help. So if that's you, then get in touch." And I wrote to him a while after that post went up, and we began sending emails backwards and forwards to each other. And that was how we came to write the Dark Mountain Manifesto and to start what was initially intended as kind of a literary journal. That was the idea Paul had floated at the end of that blog post, and it grew in that direction, but also in many other directions. And I know that some of you have been reading the Dark Mountain Manifesto recently, so you are probably more familiar with it at this moment in time than I am. But when I look back to when we started writing it in 2008, what I remember us saying is, it's time to look down. It's time to stop busying ourselves with activity of one kind or another, even activism that serves as a way to distract ourselves from the fears that keep us awake in the middle of the night. And it's time to create spaces where it's possible to talk about our doubts and our darknesses and our fears and not knowing what to do. And, you know, that didn't feel like it was very welcome in some of the activist spaces that Paul and I had been part of in the years before we wrote the manifesto. And as we were starting to map that out for the first time in the manifesto, we tried to do it by naming these myths: the myth of progress, the myth of human separation from nature, the myth of civilization, which turns the whole of human history into something converging on particular moments that leave a lot of documentation and a lot of ruins. And then there's a turn partway through where we say the problem with these is not that they're myths, but that they're the wrong myths, or they're unhelpful myths. You know, to the extent that they ever fitted the landscape, they no longer do so. They've become like bad maps that are getting us deeper into the trouble we're in. And so that was an important distinction. This is not about calling out myths in order to get to the facts and the truth. It wasn't a Richard Dawkins kind of a move. And from that turn of saying the problem is that, you know, these are both unhelpful myths and myths that we don't even recognize are myths, we think they're just how things are, came another thought, which was perhaps the role of culture in all of this goes deeper than is often allowed. Like, on the one hand, if part of how we got into the mess the world is in is the result of myths, then culture is there deep down in the root. But perhaps also those of us who work in one way or another within those practices which modernity calls culture, perhaps we might need to show up in a different way to the way we're generally invited to show up. You know, artists and writers are generally invited to help deliver the message from the climate scientists, activists, campaigners, policymakers, NGOs, as if art is a communications tool or a cheap alternative to an advertising agency. And that didn't feel true to me or to Paul as writers. And at the same time, we felt like there might be other ways we needed to show up, which people didn't know how to ask us for. And we called the manifesto Uncivilization. And now and then over the years, it's created misunderstandings because it can sound like we were simply representing anti-civilization thinking that has existed within certain schools of anarchism and so on. And whilst we were, you know, interested in and engaging with that amongst other sources, for us, uncivilization referred to something else. It refers to a kind of process of unweaving the bundle of things that have been woven together into this big story of civilization, big story of progress, so that we can make moves which attempt to leave behind some things and carry forward some things and weave in some threads that got dropped earlier in the story. So it's this move of unweaving and reweaving. And somebody said to me the other day, yeah, the unweaving is a bit like, you know, you've got this blanket that's cozy and comforting and keeps you warm. But in order to make the journey we're being asked to go on, it's necessary to unweave that and feel some of the cold for a while. And over the years, I've come to see more clearly than I did when we wrote the manifesto that, at least from one angle, what we were talking about as uncivilization might be one of the counterparts, starting from, you know, places where I have called home, whether it's England, where I grew up, or Sweden, where I have settled, to do some of the work that, starting from elsewhere, might use a language like decolonization. It's not the only resonance of uncivilization. It's not the only thing that might serve as a counterpart, but certainly those have been the conversations I've found most helpful over the years, have been with people who have taught me about the bits that were missing from the story we tried to tell in the manifesto because of where we were starting from, and the bits where it matched up to stories that were being told from elsewhere with a clearer picture of what it has been like to be on the receiving end of processes of modernization and of the history of modernity, coloniality. When we published the manifesto and began to sort of take it out into public, one of the most forceful responses we got from a number of directions, often from friends within the worlds of environmental activism we've been part of, was guys, you've given up, and worse, you're encouraging others to give up. And this was always said as though giving up was always automatically, necessarily an absolute moral failing. And just at a gut level, that didn't feel right to me. And because with a lot of force, this accusation of giving up was thrown at me and at Paul in those early years, somehow giving up, I've realized, became a question that I've been carrying that's branched in all sorts of directions that I couldn't have seen at the time. The person who I think first helped me begin to bring this into focus was the one person who Paul and I knew in common when we met, who was an old Mexican activist and, as he would say, deprofessionalized intellectual, Gustavo Esteva. And I had met Gustavo because I had been very deeply influenced by the work of Ivan Illich. And in 2007, I traveled to Cuernavaca in Mexico because some of Illich's surviving friends were having a gathering to mark the 5th anniversary of his death. And there's at least one person on this call who I first met in Mexico in 2007. And Gustavo was another of the people who I met, and we met a number of times over the years that followed when he was in Europe, and I traveled back twice to Mexico in 2011 and then 2012 to film some conversations with him. And because I felt like he was holding some of the clues that I was looking for from the process that Paul and I had set in motion when we wrote the manifesto. And so I found myself 10 years ago last month, sat in the garden of Gustavo's house in the village in Oaxaca that had been his grandmother's village, his indigenous grandmother who was not allowed through the front door of the house in Mexico City in Gustavo's childhood, because Gustavo's mother genuinely felt that the best thing that she could do for her children, having married a white Mexican man, was to try and spare her children the stigma of indigeneity that she had experienced. And therefore her mother had to enter through the back door of the house and was not allowed to speak her own language to her grandchildren. And I knew many of these stories before I traveled that year to record these conversations. I had read and heard the story of the 3 turnings in Gustavo's life that he would tell so powerfully, how he got swept up as a young man in the promises of development in Mexico in the 1950s as the American corporations were arriving. By the age of 22, he was the youngest ever executive at IBM. And at 22, he walked away from that because he said, I could see the gap between the promise that we had been sold and that we were selling people and the reality of how this was all being done to the benefit of the bosses, not the workers. And so then he went off and became a Marxist guerrilla. And as he would say, this was in the years of Che and the Cuban Revolution, this was the thing to do. And for a number of years, that was his commitment. And then one of the leaders in the group he was part of shot another leader in a fight over somebody's girlfriend. And he saw this murderer, and he said he saw a revelation of the violence that they were trying to unleash on society, and he realized that he couldn't be part of it. So he didn't turn away from all of the political commitments, but he realized that he could no longer be part of that mode of politics. And over the years that followed, he became a civil servant, and he rose very high up in the Mexican civil service. He was in charge of a program that was organizing the fixing and controlling of prices of basic commodities throughout Mexico. And in 1976, there was a new government forming, and he was offered a ministerial position. And again, for the 3rd time, he turned it down and walked away. And that was the point when he began to go and work in the barrios in Mexico City with these movements that were starting with landless indigenous peasants arriving in the city. It's, a story that then later feeds into what happened with the emergence of the Zapatistas as well, and Gustavo was very involved with that. But he said in the early years, after he turned down the ministerial post in 76, he was really in a crisis because he was reading more and more from different academic disciplines and different sets of political theories to explain the experiences he was having at the grassroots with these movements. And nothing that he read made sense of his experience and the experience of his friends and collaborators, because wherever he looked, these people were being defined in terms of lack, in terms of what they didn't have, in terms of their need and deprivation and depression. And it wasn't that there was no truth in that, but they also had things that were missing from the literature. And there was happiness and joy and knowledge about how to live and how to live together, and what Ivan Illich would call conviviality, that existed there that he had not experienced in the worlds that he had been part of for much of his adult life. And he said after 2 years of reading, he reached this crisis where he had to choose. He said, and I took off the spectacles of all of the academic study I had done. And he said, 2 things saved me from going mad. One was the stories that his grandmother had told him in the marketplace in Oaxaca when he was a child. And the other was discovering the work of Illich, because Illich was the one thinker he found who was able to speak to the lives of the people he was working with, and who he could read together with them. And people would be like, yeah, that makes sense. It fits. And so he became friends with Illich, and that was how I met him. And Paul Kingsnorth had met him because he went to write about the Zapatistas in his first book, One No, Many Yeses, and interviewed Gustavo for that. But what I heard very clearly in 2012, listening to Gustavo tell the story again, was this thing about the moment of those turnings, and especially the third turning, where he said, I couldn't explain to anyone, nor to myself, why I was turning down that job, why it didn't make sense for me to be part of this new government. I just knew that I had to. And there was a courage there to step out into the wilderness without being able to defend your decision that resonated very strongly for me. And I've come to understand it over the years in terms of there being a moment when giving up is a necessary step, a precondition for becoming able to see the world otherwise and find the moves that are called for, because you can't see that from the position that you were in until you've given up and walked away. And you can't get a promise that there is going to be something on the other side of that act of giving up that makes it safe. You have to take the risk that there might be nothing waiting for you. It might never make sense again. And what I began to realize is that to give up is maybe always to give up on something, though at the time it may well feel like everything, until you've made that move of letting go and walking away and found yourself in a place in which you can see things that you couldn't see from where you were standing before. So what I want to do in the rest of this talk is just share a few of the forms of giving up, or maybe the things that I am suggesting in different parts of the book we might need to give up on. And I didn't realize when I wrote it that this was a book about how to give up. That's just a title of a chapter near the end of it. But actually, as I've walked back through it, I've seen that it's much more of a kind of unifying theme. So the first thing that I think, speaking about this thing that gets called the Anthropocene, speaking about the trouble the world is in, including the kinds of trouble that show up under the name of climate change, is that we have to give up control. And there's a passage that became very important to me as I was writing the book, from a book that was edited in 2018 by Marisol de la Cadena and Mario Blazer, a book called A World of Many Worlds. And in the introduction to that, they have an amazing passage where they're talking about how this buzz around the Anthropocene emanating from places like Berlin and Paris and New York and London, and these kind of centers of modernity, coloniality, spilling out of the hard sciences into social sciences and arts and museums and art projects, how all of this might be sounding from elsewhere. And they say it can sound as if the world of the powerful, in the language of the Zapatistas, the world of the powerful is now sensitive to the plausibility of its own destruction in a way that may compare, at least in some ways, with the threat imposed on worlds sentenced to disappearance in the name of the common goods of progress, civilization, development, and liberal inclusion. As I put it, we went around the world, ending other people's worlds and calling it progress, and now it begins to dawn on us that our world too could end. And what they frame as that introductory chapter goes on is a fork in the road, two very different paths that you can go to from that awakening, that sense of alarm, that sudden realization of the precarity of the world of those who thought of themselves as the winners of modernity. On the one hand, it can be a humbling. It can be a moment at which it becomes possible to come down off our pedestals and see the things we weren't seeing, listen to what people had been trying to tell us from elsewhere for so long, enter into a dialogue that has a chance of becoming real. On the other hand, that sense of precarity, that sense of living at the end of a world, can become the license for reinvigorating the projects of modernity. Precisely the sense of urgency and panic can become the moral legitimacy that had been lost for global projects of control and management, emanating once again from the same centers of Western power and the inheritors of that. And I spent the day yesterday with Vandana Shiva because she's been here in Sweden, and speaking to her about what she is seeing with how net zero is playing out as a new form of colonization and land grab. This becomes very, very literal very quickly in the situation that we're in. So that brings me to the next kind of giving up that I think might be called for. And this was one of the things that scared me when I began to write this book, because at the beginning of the process, the half-serious title for the book was Why I'm No Longer Talking to People About Climate Change. And I'm very glad that everybody talked me out of that. But there's a sense in which that is what this book is. It's having spent most of my adult life being someone who stands up in front of rooms full of people and talks to them about climate change, and reaching a point about 18 months ago where I felt really viscerally, it's time to stop talking about climate change, and then went, what on earth could that possibly mean? How on earth could that be true, even just for me? And I had to write the book in order to answer that question. And where it's brought me to is that, if you think of that fork in the road that Blaise and De La Cadena helped me to see clearly, those two utterly contrasting ways we can respond to the news of the times we're in. The difficulty with talking about climate change is that it can mean either of those things. It can make it sound like, it can make us feel as if we're on the same side as people who are pursuing something diametrically opposite to what we would wish to be contributing to. But more seriously than that, I think in the last 5 years, we have arrived at a place where the language of climate change is now owned in a new way by the engineers and marketeers of that big path, that reboot of modernity, that kind of desperate eco-modernist response. And I think that the pandemic has contributed to this, because we've had an escalation of the rhetorical authority of science within our societies. Any conversation about climate change always starts within a space of science, because climate change is framed for us helpfully by the work of science. But it's always been my role as someone who talks about climate change to say, climate change asks us questions that climate science cannot answer. And that's been really fruitful, not least in dialogue with climate scientists who are grateful for not having all of the weight of knowing this thing placed on their shoulders. But we've gone from unite behind the science 5 years ago in Fridays for the Future to following the science in 2020. And without wanting to get tangled up in the COVID culture war, that has left us in a place where the possibility of having a conversation that starts within the space of science and moves beyond that has become significantly harder. And the polarizations around the science in our societies have become so extreme that it no longer seems obvious to me that talking about climate change can be as helpful as it was 5 years ago in the beginnings of those 2018 movements, as a way to invite the people who are most sheltered from the shadow side of modernity into an encounter with its consequences, into an encounter with living in a time of endings, and onto that journey that a book like Hospicing Modernity by Vanessa Machado de Oliveira helps us so much with. I feel like we probably need to start elsewhere now, because any conversation about taking climate change seriously and tackling climate change is increasingly owned by those for whom it becomes the source of legitimacy for rebooting the projects of modernity and reauthorizing them. And that's only one example of the words we might need to give up on. So this is a sense of giving up on words that once mattered to us, words that were once helpful and have ceased to be so. Sustainability ends up meaning sustaining the ways of living of the Western middle classes at all costs. That's not what it started out meaning, but that's where it ends up. And so we have to be prepared to walk away from language that we've invested a lot in, language that has mattered to us, because it means something else now. It's all been put on the signs that point to the slip road onto this highway to nowhere that is the big path, that is the only version of the future modernity can imagine. And where do we go at that point? Well, one answer is that we might need to spend time with people who know something about doing strange things with language, who have a trickster approach to language. Poets know a lot about that. Religious traditions know a lot about that as well, because once you start sitting with it, you notice how much of religious language is about using words in a way to deliberately push language to its breaking point, in a way to deliberately point to things that you're saying cannot be named. And I think these are all helpful places. I also think Ian McGilchrist's work, The Master and His Emissary, is very helpful, coming from a really different place to a lot of the material I'm drawing on in the book, from a mixture of Western philosophy and neuroscience, and arriving at such similar insights about the relationship between the brain hemispheres and this way of using language that modernity has valued that comes from one side of the brain. So that's, giving up on words that have mattered to us is part of it. Another thing that was going on for me in the book was I was trying to process some very strange experiences I had in 2018, 2019, as a result of the impact that Jem Bendel's deep adaptation paper made and some of the conversations I got invited into at that moment, where I started to meet people deep inside national and international institutions who had had a complete loss of faith in the story that their institutions were telling about how we were going to deal with climate change. They were really thrown into a kind of existential crisis. But what I wasn't ready for was that they were thrown into a kind of dark pessimism that was very, very different in flavor to anything I had experienced in the work around Dark Mountain. Because Dark Mountain was always, in some senses, edge work. It was an invitation to people to step out to the edges, admittedly within the edges of the center, but it was creating very different kinds of spaces, whereas these people were still deep inside their institutional spaces, having privately arrived at this place of blank pessimism and despair. And what I came to recognize was that it was as though they had had a loss of faith, but were still stuck inside the theology that belonged to the faith they had lost. They no longer believed in the stories that their institutions were telling about how we were going to tackle climate change, save the world, build a sustainable future. But they still believed that that was what was needed. They still believed that that was the only path. And so they were stuck in a pessimism that went way deeper than anything that I had experienced. And this pessimism had to do with being convinced that you knew how the story ended. So you no longer believed in the one story of modernity, but you believed in its shadow, which is, this is the end of the world. And some of the people who were articulating this most powerfully, I think genuinely would have said that they were at a place of surrender, which was a language that I was using a lot in 2018, 2019. I was saying, it's not about making the ways of living of the Western middle classes sustainable. It's about negotiating the surrender of these ways of living. And these would be people who were saying, we need to surrender these illusions on which we've based the stories we've been telling about responding to climate change. But what I noticed was that the one thing they weren't surrendering was their certainty. So that certainty had become attached to this end of the world story, this apocalyptic story. And only letting go of that would have arrived at that real place of vulnerability that is what happens when you walk away in the way that Gustavo had taught me you have to do before you get to see anything else. The fourth kind of giving up that I have on my list is giving up on agency, or at least giving up on the monopoly on agency that is assumed in most of the rooms where the conversations about climate change take place. And it was Vanessa Andreotti, who also writes as Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, who brought this into focus for me. When it was the 10th anniversary of Dark Mountain, for the 10th anniversary issue, I thought, the manifesto grew out of these conversations I'd been having over a couple of years with Paul Kingsnorth that had been incredibly important to me. For the 10th anniversary, I want to do a conversation with someone who's been equally important as a conversation partner at this point in my life. And it was Vanessa, who had been, such a strong influence on me in those years. And so we had this conversation, and right at the end of it, she said, when we take this hospicing modernity work and talk about hospicing modernity and assisting with the birth of something new, unknown, and possibly, but not necessarily wiser, a sticking point we find is that people assume that all the agency lies with humans. And then they can't believe that humans can do it. And because they can't believe that, but they're stuck with the idea that all the agency lies with humans, they end up not able to believe in the possibility that the story can go on. And when I came back to that passage as I was writing the book, I went, it's worse than that. It's not even just that we locate all the agency with us as a species. It's that all the agency is located with a small minority of humans who are the world's most modern people, the people who live closest to the future, the people who get invited to the rooms where the decisions are made when it comes to tackling climate change and the rest of it. And the possibility that the agency from which the world after the end of the world as we know it, the world begins to come, might not be even on the maps of the people in those rooms. That's part of what is unimaginable and contributes to that place of kind of blank despair, or worse, what I see is people inside institutions cycling between blank despair and desperate optimism that is willing to bet on more and more dangerous and desperate methods in response to the fear about the urgency of the climate crisis. And somehow we have to break that cycle and invite people off that loop. And I really hope that this book might be helpful to some of those people who I've crossed paths with in giving them permission to do that move of walking away, which doesn't necessarily mean leaving your institution. I love the distinction that Vanessa makes between divestment and disinvestment, where divestment from modernity is the fantasy of somehow getting off its grid, getting out of being implicated, whereas disinvestment is knowing that you can't get off that grid, and to the extent that it even looks like that, that's a product of your privilege within modernity. But you can stay within it and choose different ways to be within it, and choose not to be invested in its stories, and see what changes and what becomes possible as a result of that decision. So the question I'm left with is one that I voiced in the early years of Dark Mountain as, what do you do after you stop pretending? And it's come back to me lately as, what do you do after you've given up. And the great actor and theatre maker Mark Rylance gave an interview in The Guardian last autumn where he talked a bit about Dark Mountain. And he said right at the end of the interview, he came out with the most amazing riff on the image of the Dark Mountain, which Paul found in the poetry of Robinson Jeffers and we took, and lots of other people have done things with. And Rylance's version of it went like this. He said, "It's the time now for us to come down the dark side of the mountain and not keep going towards the light that represents power over everything. I know that feeling very well from these hikes in the mountains. Late in the day, you're trying to get down to the river to make a camp, and it's hairy. You're likely to twist your ankle with a heavy pack on your back as the light fades. But that image is very true for me and for where we are right now. We've got to come down into the darkness and into all the things that are chaotic. It's time to admit we're powerless." As I read and reread that, I thought, wait a minute, those words are really familiar. And in the last few years, I've been part of a set of conversations that began with something I said at the meeting where Maya and Bayo and I first met in Paris, which was, I think if we really wake up to what the climate crisis is asking for, it looks more like Alcoholics Anonymous, but on the scale of cultures that are addicted rather than individuals that are addicted. And the first step in AA, in the 12 steps, is we admitted that we were powerless over our addiction. That giving up is the first step towards the work of giving up, in the sense of giving up on substances that are killing you, which is what AA knows about. And so apart from taking this book out into the world, the other work that I'm doing this year is Anna, my partner, and I, who are creating this little school, a school called Home. We're working with an organization called Black Elephant, started by a guy called Felix Marquardt, who has been in recovery for 8 years, I think now, and who I was introduced to by Vanessa Andriotti, because she said, you guys are talking about the same thing, you need to meet. And we're working with the mythographer and storyteller Martin Shaw, and the theologian Liz Oldfield, and the pagan theorist of the political and the spiritual Reed Wildermuth, and all sorts of other extraordinary people, towards a gathering, a journey that leads to a gathering in Patmos in Greece this June called Meta Plus Physics, where we're trying to bring together some of these learnings, both from within 12-step and the recovery movement, from the work that I've been involved with Dark Mountain, and from lots of other places, towards this question of what does the day-by-day work of recovery, of giving up, and of regrowing a living culture looking a lot like those two things? What might that begin to look like in practice? So I think that's what I've got for you today. That's where I've got to so far from this question. But maybe just to say as well, I had no idea when I was feeling quite battered and under attack, being told, you guys, you've given up, and you're encouraging other people to give up, and it's wrong. I could not have imagined then that what felt initially like attack and abuse might turn out to be the question that I was carrying that would prove so fruitful in so many directions. So I'm grateful to the people who threw that at me, however many years ago it is now, in the beginnings of Dark Mountain. So there we are. Next time you're having things thrown at you, keep an eye out to that element of surprise, that it might turn out to be a question that takes you somewhere you wouldn't have imagined.
Thank you very much, Dougald, for your wonderful talk. It was really amazing, and it's mind-boggling for all of us. The talk that comes in these decisive moments for all of us. And also, as you were talking about this climate change thing, it makes me remember, just recently where I went and what I was doing. And I felt like similar to what you have mentioned in your talk. Like at the UNCBD event, the final decision makers, who claim to be, or many big things, of course, but I find them as climate hypocrites, not really serious on the climate thing. And also, you mentioned about this how to give up, which we, of course, read recently, your Dark Mountain manifesto. And it was really clear for us now with this follow-up talk. It really helps us to understand better. And also, like I can relate it to my traditional folklore folktale and a proverb, of course, which says, take a step back for a better step ahead. So thank you very much for your wonderful talk here with us. And we also have here a wonderful roundtable discussion from great speakers. So before we start the roundtable discussion, let me introduce our roundtable speakers. So we have here three interesting scholar speakers. Let me introduce them one by one. Our first speaker is Bayo Akomolafe. Bayo is a PhD scholar rooted with the Yoruba people in a more than human world. Is the father to Alethea and Takaya, a grateful life partner to Ije, son and brother, a widely celebrated international speaker, post-humanist thinker, poet, teacher, public intellectual, essayist, and author of 2 books. These Wilds Beyond Our Fences, Letters to My Daughter on Humanity's Search for Home. And we will tell our own story. The Lions of Africa Speak. Bayo is the founder of the Emergence Network and host of the online post-activist course, We Will Dance with Mountains. He currently lectures at the Pacifica Graduate Institute, California, and University of Vermont, Burlington, Vermont. He sits on the board of many organizations, including Science and Non-Duality, US, and Local Futures Australia. In July 2022, Dr. Akomolafe was appointed the inaugural Global Senior Fellow of University of California's Authoring and Belonging Institute. He has also been appointed Senior Fellow for the New Institute in Hamburg, Germany. Our next speaker is Ciclón Olivares. Ciclón is the co-founder of Symbiopoiesis Productions and SK Symbiotic transmedia research platforms that collaborate with life forms within and beyond the technosphere. Their work engages conceptual activisms and develops technologies of consciousness to contend with the conflicted effects of terror and pleasure and strife amid mass extinctions. They also have conducted in situ ethnography in China, India, Chile, Germany, and the US, including documentary and interventionist work with tattoo pigs, commodified as art in Beijing, and feral canine communities in Santiago and Goa. Symbiopoiesis Productions, video art, multi-species architecture, and performance lectures have been exhibited worldwide, including at the Worley House, an archive inspired by Donna Haraway's multi-species writings on cold evolution, at Documenta, and many other exhibitions. Ciclón's Publications range from theoretical writing to the speculative manifesto included in Modified Living as a Cyborg, published in 2021. They currently teach animals, ethics, and representation at Pratt Institute. Our third and last speaker is none other than Maya Kóvskaya. She's Maya is a PhD scholar and is the founder and the head of the AMOR MUNDI Multispecies Ecological Worldmaking Lab, and teaches multispecies Anthropocene studies and theory at Chiang University in the Faculty of Social Science. They have published widely on the intersection of the political, linguistic, and ecological with performative, semiotic, and visual culture. Their eco-philosophical work elaborates what they call the Anthropocene, interrogating the workings of the invidious, hierarchical, dualist division between humans and the modern human world. And their multi-species ethnographic work explores what they call feral agency, modern humans, speech acts, multi-species, language gains, ego performativity, and ego symbiosis, which is to investigate the extra linguistic ways that nature speaks. Understanding how nature speaks can help us rethink the human in a modern human world, better conceptualize politics beyond the human, and imagine multi-species polities as shared sites of symbiopoiesis, symbiotic shared world-making practices against the Anthropocene. So now we'll be kicking off with the roundtable discussion. Before we kick off with the roundtable discussion, let me again remind you about the housekeeping rules. And while discussion is going on, if you want to ask questions, you may kindly put in the chat box. And after the discussion also, of course, you will have time for question and answer session. So we will start our wonderful roundtable discussion here. Please take the floor.
Hey, Athong, thank you so very much. That was wonderful. And it's great that you do your first moderation for what I hope is many. Welcome everybody, wonderful people who didn't see the very beginning, and all our wonderful speakers, Dougald, Ciclón, Bayo, Athong, and the wonderful audience. I have a request to sort of invert the paradigm of videos on for the moment, because it can be very distracting. And we had somebody screen share by accident. So it can be, can we just all videos off if you are not one of the roundtable speakers or Dougald and Athong? And then we would love lots of questions in the chat. And if you're shy, you make a note and Athong can read them for you. And if you want to speak in your own voice, then that's fine too. Just indicate so that when Athong is going through and fielding questions for us, that he will be able to get what your wishes are. And we apologize if we can't get to all the questions. This is a very vibrant audience with a lot of people, so we probably won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll do our best after a good roundtable discussion has gone on for a little while. So can I get everybody, other than our roundtable speakers and our moderator, to video off, and let's go into the conversation. It's so great to see you all. Bayo and I and met at the same place. I knew Dougald online for some time already, but we met in Paris for the first time in real life. Ciclón and I go way back to the early Anthropocene campuses in Berlin, where we were the double trouble, eco-modernist harassers and provocateurs. And Athong is in our program, for those of you who have not been introduced yet. So those of you who haven't been part of our events before, we're like an anti-conference or an unconference, to take the uncivilization kind of track. We want to not perform our, professional competence or grandstand, but we want to start from a place of deep vulnerability, the incompleteness of our knowledge, and really try to use some of the affordances of Dougald's talk to talk about some of these big, difficult questions that he has raised that all of us care deeply about and have various different insights about. So I would like to see if Bayo could start us, since it's the first time joining our MUNDI lab talks. Do you want to start with any thoughts, or would you like to go a little later since you just were able to join the chat? Do you want to catch your breath? It's up to you. We're chill here, so.
Catching my breath, it would be like tea at this moment. So yes, I would like a cup of tea.
Okay.
But thank you.
Sure.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Then in that case, how about Ciclón? Do you want to start with some thoughts? And then those of you who are new to this, we're just going to have a rambling, freewheeling, free for all for a while, and then we'll invite the audience to join us at some point when it seems like the right time. We'll know it when it happens, I hope.
I definitely have something to start us with.
Go for it.
And this is to engage all of our dark screened participants who were very attentive during the talk, and I loved seeing your faces. I feel like the Zoom platform has really enabled us to meet with people in different time zones. For me, it's very early in the morning. It's raining where I am, and that's also strange, right? We're in very different realities right now. But because I just came from the dream world, and because Dougald mentioned the importance of looking for another type of language, right? A language that is not the language that we know of, which was very compelling to me, and something that, I'm hoping that I'm trying to do as well. I have a request from everyone here, and you can participate if you like or not. Would you be willing to share with me via chat your climate dreams? What is your most recent climate dream that you've had? Could be anxious, could not be, right?
Nightmares okay too?
Nightmares are definitely welcome as well. I won't do anything with them, but I'm very curious to learn more about them.
Is
And
this for the whole audience?
For the whole audience. I mean, you can send it to me in the chat. You can share it publicly if you feel like that. If you're an exhibitionist like me, it's up to you what you do and how to share it. And if it's not for me, I would encourage you to write it down and to look at it and to kind of engage with that dream world in the language that you find possible. And then my question for our roundtable would be, if you're willing to share some of your dreams and what those dreams say to you. And then if you don't want to play with this game that I'm proposing, that's fine as well. And so I would just ask Dougald then to help us or guide us into some of this language play, right? That you're finding useful. You mentioned a few people that I managed to jot down very quickly. You mentioned Vanessa Andriati and Vanessa Machado Oliveira. Did I get that right?
That's right. That's the same person, right?
Oh, it's the same person. Okay, excellent. And then I also have Gustavo Esteva written down as someone that I'm going to look up. I don't know Ivana Lich's work either, and I don't know about net zero land grabs and what that is. So those are like questions that I have pending. And then I guess because I want people to write down their dreams and I don't want them to be distracted, I'm going to share somebody who has really compelled me in terms of their writing. And I don't know their name off the top of my head, which is terrible. I downloaded this article from academia.edu, and I can't remember the scholar's name. It's a fascinating scholar who's working on space colonization. So already thinking about the colonization of the universe and the cosmos. And I can't remember his name. And the article that he posted in academia.edu is called on everything that Ursula K. Le Guin didn't say about the Anthropocene. And this article is because he actually went to an event that was at University of California, Santa Cruz. I want to say back in 2014, 2016. I'm not sure what year it was. I can't remember. I was not present, but a lot of people that I love participated in that conference. It was a conference that brought together Donna Haraway, Ursula Le Guin, Anna Tsing, and I believe Elaine Gahn was one of the organizers of this. So if you don't know any of these people, they're people who are, writing many of the key books that all of us are reading. Dougald cites Anna Tsing's Capitalism in the Ruins book about mushrooms in his introduction. So I know we're reading the same things from your book that I managed to read. And I think that you would really love this article too. And basically what this author is doing is he is recapping what was not said by Ursula Le Guin at this conference. So he's thinking with the silences, right? So when we think about language and how language is doing things differently, right? Or how we have to seek out a language, I think it's really important to think about the silence, right? Like, what does the silence say? I am perturbed by the silence on social media. You throw out things and then you don't get anything back, and that perturbs me. Like, I don't understand how to relate to people sometimes. And so I thought this was a very nice way of working with silence in, these amazing scholars. And so he talks about how Ursula Le Guin actually doesn't name the word Anthropocene the entire time during this lecture. And Ursula Le Guin keeps on coming back to poetry, right? She keeps on coming back to poetry being the language that we have to sit with. And about how, Ursula Le Guin is also this anti-techno-fix mentality, right? Which is what this big path is proposing to us. This big path is proposing to us that we can be saved, with, eliminating atmospheric gases or, sustainability programs or government policy, et cetera, which there's a lot of us who are skeptical or resistant to this kind of new frontier of sustainability careerism, right, across multiple disciplines and institutions. And so I think Ursula Le Guin is a nice example of someone who's actually, asking us to listen to the world around us, right? She's actually asking us to listen to the stones, to the rocks. And I can't find the citation I was looking for because I didn't have it ready, but I did want to just kind of put that out there and see what comes back.
Dougald, do you want to respond to that? Or Bayo?
The thing about, well, I have something to say too. Now that my sister has invited me in with a cup of tea, I'm thinking about the dream or the nightmare. I'm not very good with dreams. I sleep very heavily, too heavily to dream. But I'm going to say a few things about. Or Maya, is this a space where I can say something as well? Or
You can say anything you want. There are no rules, unless you're like.
Is this radical enough for me to jump up and start twerking? Is twerking allowed here?
You can do whatever you want.
Dougald, I missed, and I should apologize to everyone. There was some confusion with the time, but I know what Dougald wrote in his book because I've read it. And I know the deep call of that book is, in my sense of things, to shapeshift, right? We're not going to, maybe I'll just put it in terms of this story. So I've been quite fascinated, and Maya, you know this, because I reached out to you last year about some lost iteration of the popular story of Pinocchio, right? And I told you to help me look for it. And this is where it came from. So we all know that Carlo Collodi wrote the story of Pinocchio. What many people do not know is that there was a different version that came out almost 100 years later, written by Alexei Tolstoy. Has no relationship to Leo Tolstoy. This is called The Adventures of Buratino, right? The Adventures of Buratino. And I'm dying. I will pay you $1 million, most of which will come from Dougald's earnings from this book. If you can send me a copy, if you have a copy of this manual, manuscript, I would pay you heavily for it. It's a fascinating story that turns on its head the Disney-esque notion of a wooden boy becoming a real boy, right? That's the Disney story. The wooden boy and his father, Geppetto, is it Geppetto or Geppetto, he prays for his wooden boy to become a real boy. And at the end, that's what happens. He becomes a real boy. But Alexei Tolstoy told a different story. This boy does not become real because he questions the notion of real, right? The boy is wooden and he resists a fascist order that insists on his conformity, and he becomes wooden. He stays wooden till the end. And I've been fascinated by this account of things. I watched Guillermo del Toro's story, his own iteration, his own take on Pinocchio. If you haven't watched it, it's on Netflix. My family and I just watched it right now, and it is beautiful. Now, the reason why we're fascinated by Pinocchio in my family is, well, the story is part of my next book. And it's part of my next book because my son is on the autistic spectrum, right? He's 5 years old. And like that Disney father, I once prayed, in spite of the fact that I'm a recovering psychotherapist, recovering is emphasized there. In spite of that fact that I understand to some degree, I'm trained to understand these things, I prayed for my son to become real. I felt that I was given by the universe a wooden boy, right? And everything within me, bodily, my demons, everything, we want to get vulnerable, Maya, right? This is me being fragile. Everything within me wanted to fix him. I felt he was depriving me of my own son, that he was a shadow of the son or the relationship that I could have had with my son. And so my whole body, my whole gesturing was towards fixing him. One day we were in the shopping mall, and I've told this story many times. We were in the shopping mall, and my wife and daughter were in front, and I was holding Kea, that's his name, and we're walking behind, and Kea suddenly fell down. And he fell down overwhelmed by something that my neurotypical mind could not access, right? And he started to flail and scream, and I wanted him to get back to order, right? A friend of mine, a professor of psychology, told me that psychology is the policeman of capitalism. And this is true, right? To many degrees. I held him and said, get yourself together, man, because I don't like to be embarrassed in public, one of my other cracks, right? And so I was trying to speak to him to kind of rationalize the situation away, and I was failing woefully. And my wife walked up to me and she said, walk away, just walk away. I will handle this. And so I did, because she's the boss. And so I walked away with my daughter and just viewed from a distance. And what my wife did was to just lay down on the floor next to him. No word spoken, no trying to fix him, no rehabilitation, in the spirit of that radical visionary, Fernandellini, in post-Second World War, in the 1960s, in the south of France, no trying to fix any autistic children, just accompanying them, just being alongside them, right? And she just stayed there in public, people passing by. And then later they got up and went. And that was a very powerful, resonant, potent moment for me. Now, you might be wondering why I'm speaking about autism when we're speaking about climate change. You might say, this is weather, this is psychopathology. What have the two got to do with each other? It's because in the story of Pinocchio, which I started out with, there's something the director does to help us see that there's something powerful about the temporality of autism. And I think there was a desire to read that story, that idea of autism in this notion of Pinocchio, that this autism breaks the spell of cultivation, of neurotypicality. This is what Fred Moulton would say when he says Blackness is neurodiversity, right? There's something about decoloniality that calls for spillage, that calls for a break of the status quo. I started to listen to my son and learn with him, just like my sister was just speaking about listening to stones. I was here listening to wood, right? I started to listen to my son, right? He doesn't offer us the interpersonal gaze, eye contact. He doesn't give that. He will not be interpellated or appellated or hailed by my anxiety about personhood, right? He resists that. So he turns away. He does this thing that I call looking away at, right? Not looking at or looking away from. There's something middling and trickstery about the way he looks. It's a looking away at. It's a noticing of what Simon Donn would call the transversality of things. It's how things spill. He's not affixing me to one place. It's like when he turns away from me, that's when he really sees me. And I feel this autistic stance, if you will, is almost what Dougald is calling for, right? That maybe the rectilinear posture, the ways that we attempt to fix the crisis by looking at it straight in a factual way, empirical, holding the box and measuring it in that modern anxious, in that modernity anxious way. Maybe that's part of the problem. Maybe we're co-creating these paradigms of toxic cyclicity when we assume that we can just throw all our tools at this onto-epistemology, this crisis, and then it will go away if we get the geniuses in the room, right? But there's something about looking away at that dismantles the Anthropocene, that calls for something that I have called the Afrocene, which is a way of inviting us to rethink limitations, which is what my elders from Africa would say, that in times of urgency, the thing to do is to slow down, right? The times are urgent, let us slow down, right? In order to find your way, you must become lost. There is this beautiful lostness that is performed by a different kind of subjectivity, a different kind of arranging and posturing ourselves that is not available if we try to fix the problem. So just like I've stopped trying to fix my son, unconsciously, non-consciously, I'm celebrating like he's a wildflower that has come to, almost with messianic promise, that he's come to dismantle the typical ways of seeing and behaving. I think the crisis we're in is in part a co-production of posture. We are weathering bodies, like my sister Neymanis would say, we're weathering bodies. And this really calls for a shape shift. This calls for some kind of ontological mutiny. We need to break out into sensorial new diversities, or else we're trapped in this forever.
Dougald, I see so many things in your face. Would you like to respond to any of these things?
Oh, thank you, Maya. There were tears in my eyes when I was
Very moving.
Maya. And I was thinking, I mean, I wrote this in the newsletter that I sent out this morning. Yesterday, I went into Stockholm to film with Vandana Shiva. And then Greta Thunberg came to meet Vandana just to spend half an hour with her on her way home from school. But when she arrived at the hotel, Vandana had gone around the corner to have coffee with a friend, and no one knew which coffee shop she was in. So then there's Greta and my editor and a volunteer who was working with us and me sitting in this hotel lobby. And I was just thinking about, like, when you meet her, you know, she has that kind of autistic gaze of looking away at that you describe. And it doesn't come across in a situation like this, but I'm quite a shy person. And there's lots of things that I wrote about in the book about Greta and Fridays for the Future and the role that she has been carrying in these last few years. And I really think that what you're speaking to there, Bayo, connects so much to her presence and her way of being, and this sidestepping of all of these things that she's been encountering that has allowed her to carry that. So it was really lovely just to meet her for 10 minutes. And I felt kind of almost silly afterwards because we didn't talk about like any of the stuff. We didn't talk about, you know, her work. We didn't talk about the stuff that written about in the book. The four of us had this kind of jokey conversation about language and about like the difficulty of learning Swedish because everyone speaks such good English and wants to speak English with you. And I said, yeah, my son who's 7, like he said to me, Pappa, du kan inte alla ord på svenska. You don't know all the words in Swedish. And so now whenever I do a talk in Swedish, I start by quoting him, telling, so we were all laughing about this. And then as we were speaking about language today, suddenly it's like, oh no, actually, maybe that was exactly what we needed to be talking about. We didn't, like, if we'd sat there for 10 minutes and had a conversation about climate change, I would have learned nothing from writing a book which started out with me saying, maybe it's time to stop talking about climate change. And this thing about silence, Ivan Illich says somewhere, he writes about silence again and again at different times in his life. And in a really early talk, he says, if you learn someone's language without learning its silences, that is an act of violence. And with the dreams, I had a series of nights in a row with powerful dreams recently, but they've kind of begun to melt away, so I'm not sure I can call any of them back to mind. But in the 2 years when I was working with the National Theatre here in Sweden, and I had this great fortune to get to spend quite a bit of time with this question of like, what might be the roles of art under the shadow of climate change if it's not to be a communications tool? One of the things that came through in those 2 years was we need many languages. And it's like we've only learned to speak the daylight language about the trouble the world is in. We only speak about it in this language of facts and figures and projections and the rest of it, and plans and strategies. It's not that we do not need that at all. But that language on its own cannot carry. That way of knowing becomes a way of not knowing. We also need the twilight language and the midnight language of loss and longing, and the language of those hours when you lie awake unable to sleep, and the language of the wolf hour just before dawn. And unless we show up with all of those, great violence will be done as a result of trying to talk about the trouble the world is in only using a daylight language.
There are so many wonderful things. I want to respond to them all. So let me try to respond to them somehow angled up together. And let's see if it makes any sense. So I'm teaching a class called Nature, Culture, Rethinking the Human in a More Than Human World right now to my graduate students. And my undergraduate students also know that they are often very frustrated with me that I don't like to tell them the answers in class. I resist, the neoliberal PowerPoint education as pouring some kind of, content into the vessels, the passive vessels of the students. I resist that with every fiber of my being, and it can really frustrate and upset students. But having been similarly vexed by my own political theory mentor, Hannah Pitkin, when I was an undergraduate and then a graduate student and onward in many conversations with people who I consider my teachers till this very day, because ideally we stay a student forever. I believe that the most important truths are not ones that can be told directly, and that our understanding of the world in a way that has the criticality and also the intimacy at the same time, both a kind of paradoxical, two-sided kind of a thing that we need in order to, I don't want to use the word own the world, because that's again, that still fits in with that sort of weird hegemonic capitalist neoliberal kind of language paradigm that's part of the problem. But let's call it take responsibility for it. And I love Karen Barad's discussion of responsibility as what she calls a queering of responsibility, which involves opening oneself, not only having the correct ethical response to someone else or doing the right thing, but more importantly, opening yourself up to the unexpected and unsolicited, perhaps, responses of others. Ones that you might not be ready for, especially maybe those ones. And so, you know, in teaching my classes, I'm always trying to make my students engage with super difficult texts and figure out what they think about them. Because unless we can take things with us on our journey, things to walk with on whether they're an intellectual walking stick down that dark mountain in the dark so we don't twist our ankle on, you know, the stumbling blocks of the crumbling specter of hegemonic modernity that some of us are fleeing from and others are clinging to with our claws. We won't be able to know where we're going, and perhaps we can't know where we're going, like the ones who walk away from Omelas to bring in the Gwyn. The people who leave, who walk away, maybe they don't have a destination in mind, and yet their sense of justice, of knowing that they've rejected something and they have to find a way to live better and differently, that is where they're going, that their destination isn't a place, it's a way of being, it's a way of engaging on the journey. And then I was thinking about that beautiful, touching example of your son, Bayo, and your wildflower son. I love that metaphor. I'm going to hold on to that. And thinking about what you called, as he looked away, that was when he really sees, right? Thinking about that, looking away at, as a beautiful metaphor for maybe how we start to engage with these language challenges. The language is so much the conceptual apparatus through which we speak and imagine an intersubjectively shared world, and yet we know the senses of words, as Austin or Wittgenstein or ordinary language philosophers would say, are almost always, one, heterogeneous, heterogloss, as Bakhtin would say, but also rooted in some lived practice, some experience, some shared constitutive, pragmatic ground. And Wittgenstein tells us to go back to the rough ground. And I want us to take that call and think about it in the spirit of moving down the dark mountain that maybe, you know, more than a decade ago, Dougald, you called us to climb. And now, as we go down in the dark, not sure where we are going, but knowing that what we're walking away from, finding new kinds of language, new words, new ways of understanding the world have to come from that rough ground, because they can't come from the stale or constraining straitjacket of ideas that emerged from and were instrumental in the creation of the necropolitical, you know, technocratic rationality, instrumental rationality, settler colonial, everything, you know, destructive model of modernity that has shaped the dominant formation of the world today. And so then I was thinking about that language, the kind of language that might be a language you start to understand, maybe not by looking away at, but by listening away at as well, thinking of what Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about as she urges us to listen to the teaching of plants, for example, to the teachings of ecologies, to see how prosperity is, for one, it has to be prosperity for all, or it's not real, that the flourishing has to be mutual, or it's fake flourishing, like the flourishing of the promise of progress that we've come to see so critically. And yet it's still part of the political theology, as Dougald puts it, I think so aptly, of the eco-modernists, of most people out there in the developed, you know, Euro-American upper middle class world, the people who have this, whose fingernails are still clinging to what they have and unwilling to let go and give up some of those not unwarranted, unearned privileges. And then Ciclón, your publication about dreams, to connect with all of this. Dreams, climate chaos, climate crisis. I don't even say climate change anymore. I mean, I'm thinking about another Le Guin piece. The word for world is forest. And I think the piece you were looking for was it the word for world is Earth? I was Googling when you spoke, but anyway, I'm not sure if I found it because but at any rate, in the word for world is forest, I don't know if all of you have read it, but my students have. One of the characters, the protagonist, Selver, who is, the native being of this planet that the colonizers, who are, much in the settler colonial mode, that caused mass indigenous genocide in the Americas and elsewhere across the world. Selver is, taken to do so-called voluntary, but actually slave labor. Selver's wife is raped to death by the Terran human Davidson, who is the very much like, he's the archetypal figure of Western modernity's master rationality, as Pullman calls it, right? And Selver changes the world. They're the beings, the Ascians, I cannot pronounce it with my list, but the beings of that planet lived with the forest and lived without violence. They have a way of ritually mediating conflict by singing each other down. So, you kick somebody's ass by singing to them. I mean, that's how beautiful is that? But when the Earth humans, the Terran human, came and started logging the hell out of their world, destroying it, and enslaving them and raping and murdering them like settler colonists seem to do, Selver, he broke with the dreaming ways of his people. They were lucid dreaming people who understood truths through dreams and thought that the Terran humans were like babies, like undeveloped minds, because they're dreaming. They couldn't lucid dream. They really didn't understand their dreams, and they had no way to understand the truths of the world in this way, through this indirection, this looking at by looking away, or looking away at. And at the end of the book, for those of you who haven't read it, Selver leads a violent insurrection and kills a bunch of the Terrans and drives them away. And when the delegations come and say, okay, sorry, we screwed up, we're not going to colonize your world anymore, we'll go away and never come back, but has violence continued amongst you? And he said, well, you can't really unlearn what you've learned. And the violence may be here to stay. And he was talked about as a god, as a temporary god. And he was a god in this world because, and this is the tie-in I see between a lot of these threads, because he was a translator between worlds. And he brought a new kind of world into being, right? Like Hannah Arendt's auctoritas, initiating new lines of action and relationships, for good or for bad. I mean, he was rueful, but I'm thinking about Selver dreaming new worlds into being and becoming a translator between worlds. And I think that maybe we can deal with the language question. How do we produce new kinds of language that allow us to listen to and speak to the more than human world, and to each other better? And what would constitute better, I mean, is one of the questions we have to ask. And then finally, the dream. I'll share the dream, and you can psychoanalyze it for me if you want, Bayo. The dream, my climate dream. This is a noticeable one. I'm at the top of a great mountain, literally, a great mountain, and everywhere I can see, it's water. It's like Mount Ararat or something before, like, the waters recede in this biblical myth, Noah myth. But everywhere are apex predators. It's a species, a trophic level of species that I'm studying a lot of. Apex predators, lions and tigers and bears were all around, and they were trying to flee from the water, but there was nowhere to go because we couldn't see anything else. Finally, I found some stairs, and so I followed a tiger down the stairs, and we got to the bottom of the stairs, and there was a way out through the water. But guess what I had to go through down the rest of the mountain if I wanted to descend and get away from the flood? The mountain was covered with human shit. And all I had to navigate it was my little red wagon that I used to drive around in as a 3-year-old down the hill, holding the handle, which I couldn't really steer with, and which I still have a scar on my finger from slashing open my finger as a 3-year-old from daredeviling down the mountain in my little red wagon that I couldn't really steer. because I didn't. So there I was on top of this, mountain trying to escape. And I'm like, I can't play Noah. These animals won't fit in the mountain and they know how to get down better than I do. So can I catch a ride with the tiger down the mountain in my little red wagon so that I don't have to be completely immersed in the shit of human indignities that we've actually coated the mountain with? And I don't know how the dream ended, but there's my little tie-in to the climate dreams, the language, the mountain, the travel down the mountain into the darkness. Anyway, I have said enough. I would love to hear what the rest of you think, and any thoughts you have to respond, Dougald, to anybody's thoughts, or at home.
Yeah. Thanks. It's a wonderful discussion from all of you. I think we start getting some questions from our participants. Like the first question, I think from Blake. He says, I love the discussion of accepting the ambiguity, vulnerability, and the limits of our knowledge. I'm wondering though about the idea of embracing powerlessness as a virtue or a reality. Could we not better engage with the anthropo-supremacist nature of modernity by learning to see our power as situated in a vast network of human and modern human beings with whom our lives and futures are inextricably intertwined? I would love to more about why you choose this framing. It's a question to Dougald.
Thank you, Blake. Yeah, as I heard your question, I was taken back to somebody who was a really important teacher for me, Anthony McCann, who's an Irish thinker, who these days is mostly working with ADHD. So again, we get this thread of neurodiversity being really central. I think his work is extraordinary. And we spent a lot of time together when I was in my late 20s. It was sort of, I never went to graduate school or anything like that, and he was kind of my substitute for that. And he'd been working on the dynamics of enclosure. And at a certain point in time, he said, I need to stop, because the more of this work I do, the more I'm writing the textbook for how to do enclosure. And so he moved from that to this work around crafting gentleness. And he used to talk about the politics of gentleness. There's a conversation online somewhere from about 8 or 9 years ago where the two of us sit down and I get him to say more about this politics of gentleness. And one of the bits that I took from that was he would say, we need to be really careful about how we define power, because we often define power in terms of the ability to manipulate and control and dominate. And if that's not who we want to be, if that's not what we want to do, then we've just made ourselves powerless. So I'm speaking against myself here and speaking for the question that you brought there, Blake. I think the giving up that I wanted to speak of, it's a powerlessness over, that's it. If you, and I think I sometimes I want to avoid, because the distinction between power over, I can't even remember now, but there's like 2 types of power that are named by various people as a kind of pairing. And sometimes it's almost become trite because it's been said so many times. So I've kind of wandered away from that. But if I think about Alcoholics Anonymous, the first step is we admitted that we were powerless over our addiction. So there's a trick there, which is that maybe there is another kind of power, this gentle power. And Anthony used to say, if you want to start to think about what a gentle power might look like, think of what it's like when you're holding a small baby. You have a lot of power in that situation, but it's not the kind of power we normally talk about when we talk about politics and power. So yeah, I think you've helped me to clarify what I was trying to say there, Blake. Thank you.
Would it be helpful to think about the way Hannah Arendt talked about, she's got a lot of problems in her thinking, but I find her thinking about the space of appearance as the proto-political space in which new forms of power can be constituted, power two, together, collectively, by coming together in word and deed to deliberate over how we should live together, given that we're all different. And we share only natality, mortality, and plurality, and irreducible uniqueness. Maybe the power two is so radically different from the power over that we need to focus our power on the power two part and give up the mastery of nature ideas. I don't know.
I just wanted to just throw this in as well, that there's something dark and psychic about the ways that we hear or have been coached to hear powerlessness. It's scary. It feels like a loss of agency. And there's, no matter how many texts on neo-materialisms or animisms we read, we're still beholden to these effective trances that suggest to us that the thing to do is to gather as much power to ourselves as possible, whether it's the power to claim we understand something well, whether it's the power of clarity. And I think that's how I read powerlessness here from an indigenous Yoruba perspective, is as generative incapacitation, right? It's a kind of falling apart that allows something else to happen. But that means we have to do something to how we speak about power. For me, power would be, and I don't have the time to tell the story or give some context around some stories I tell about the trickster and how the trickster traveled with the slaves across the Atlantic, and how that tells us a different story of power that is not actually, it's not resolved by saying power with or power over, right? I suggest power is the fidelity of certain specific relationships. It's how we are convened within assemblages of meaning, right? It's how we hold space for each other. It's a place-making ritual. We continue, even capture is a form of power. This might be controversial, but even being captured is a form of knowing one place within a system of meaning, right? So that powerlessness, what the Caribbean philosophers would name as bacchanal aesthetics, losing your way. It's all about breaking out of the fidelity of certain relationships. Powerlessness would be that place where we crumble. It would be where the slaves hid their treasures and their resources on the plantation, right? It would be how they snuck in their gods, you know, in the pantheon of their masters. It's a sideways intelligence, right? So modernity would say, fall apart, you know, and that's the wrong thing to do, right? That you should be rehabilitated. You should have resources. You should be productive. Within that cosmology, the fear of losing oneself overrides us. But if we start to think from a cosmology of relationship, processuality, and shared, you know, bodies, between bodies, then powerlessness is just an invitation to lose shape, to sniff out something different, to find out exquisite otherwises that are not available when we have or are in certain power fields.
Yeah, thank you, Bayo. I think Ciclón says she's gonna leave at 9, so I think we still have some few minutes to hear from Ciclón also, with regard to questions or like your ideas, you know, on the talk and the discussion. Yeah, please.
You know, I love that, Bayo, you tell stories. I'm a storyteller too, and you know, I think that I'll tell you a story. 12 years ago, on my birthday, January 5th, I woke up crying, sobbing. I had never broken through the dream world in the same way, where the tears themselves were the ones who shook me awake into this other world, which we call here. The dream was I was on a boat in the ocean, and I was with one of my favorite people in the world, a small toy poodle, 7 pounds, from Mexico called Luke. And we were together alone on that boat on the deck, looking out. And suddenly I turn around and I can't find him. And I look and I'm on the boat and there's no way to find him. In the dream, I'm not crying, but what woke me were the sobs. And it was a perturbing dream. I did not know how to read it. Later that night, I was very fortunate. I had some friends who threw me a birthday party and we celebrated with cake, chocolate cake, which is my favorite. And it calmed the perturbingness of that dream. And I think that I forced myself to forget the dream, just put it aside. 2 days later, Luke went into surgery. It was winter break, these dark months of January. I had chosen January 7th because it was supposedly a lucky number, my father always said. He went in for a preventative surgery to remove a bladder stone that was causing him to bleed when he urinated, which caused me great distress every time I saw him in pain with his movements as he urinated. To make a long story short, 12 days later, he died. 12 days from the day of the dream. So on January 17th, he died. Luke's death transformed everything. I went from being an atheist to something else. He opened a portal for me. And there was this moment when he was in the hospital during those 10 days where I guess some people would call it enlightenment. It lasted very short. It was maybe 10 minutes that it lasted, but it was this moment when I realized that death does not exist, that it's an illusion. And it was so freeing. It was so light. I was with my partner. I remember the glow of orange lights on the street in the middle of a blizzard. I hate the cold. And yet I had this moment. And like I said, it went away. It disappeared like the dream. But it remained at the same time. And that marked for me a shift in my life. That was the shape-shifting moment. More recently, Luke is the beginning of everything for me, of trying to understand the language beyond the human. He was really that diplomat for me of understanding that without words, you could speak volumes. He was a philosopher. I learned so much from him. I still learn so much from him. More recently, I'll share another dream before I leave. I dreamt that I encountered a giant tortoise. And the tortoise looked at me, and I could not read its face. And the tortoise lifted its shell and showed me underneath what it had inside of its body. All the organs, an alien world. And after pulling down the shell and having shown me that, he urinated for a very long time, a very healthy flow. Most recently, a few days ago, perhaps a delayed birthday gift, Oliver, a friend of mine with whom we shared space in the same venue of AMOR MUNDI, also one of these people who speaks to animals, asked me to take care of his turtle should he live longer than his body. I don't know if I'm a good caretaker. I don't know if I'm a responsible caretaker enough, but it was very moving to me to receive that request, to be on his list of people for whom he would be willing to entrust that care. And I can't help but think of that turtle dream. And so I told Oliver, I'm willing to consider this. I'm not going to say yes yet because I don't know what I need to know to be able to take care of Marmaduke. But I need to understand the plumbing so that I make sure that I know what to do in the moment that I potentially, speculatively, would have to take care of Marmaduke. That's as much wisdom as I can offer this early in the morning. Thank you so much, everyone, for letting me be here and to hear this wonderful presentation. Dougald, I started reading your book this morning at 5 in the morning when I woke up on my iPhone, and I got through page like 96. It's so lovely to read. There's no catch. There's nothing. I love all the citations. I can't wait to finish it. And Bayo, such a pleasure to meet you and to hear the story of the wooden boy whom we have to learn to speak with on his own terms in that dream world. So I am so thankful, Maya, as always, for being a part of this. And thank you, Athong, for letting me share some stories.
Thank you very much, Ciclón, for your, a wonderful discussion here. Thank you for your participation also. Yeah, your discussion has been also really, interesting for all of us. I think it's a food for thought for all of us too. Yeah. Dougald, we have a question from Hannah. Hannah, can you please share your question to Dougald directly?
You can turn on your mic and your video for that. Yay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, Dougald.
Hello.
And thanks for the talk, and thanks everybody for this whole event. It's very rich and engaging. Yeah, my question was about what you talk about when you no longer talk about climate change. And I was particularly interested in a moment in the talk when you mentioned about people who are very embedded in the system of modernity and in perpetuating that and relying on it. And you sort of suggested that there might be other ways of engaging with the sort of dilemma that we're in. Yeah, other than talking about climate change, what do you talk about? And it reminded me of the word trailheads, and I came across that the other day from Richard Schwartz, the founder of IFS therapy, and trailheads being this kind of where you have an incident from your life or a topic that leads you on to a path of exploring some issue and a therapeutic sort of path. So I wondered if you could share some of your ideas about what some of those trailheads might be.
Thanks, Hannah. I'm going to need to head off shortly, so I'll let this be my last contribution before I say goodbye. But it seems to me that there was a clue in the trailheads as I heard it from you there. Because very often, there is a question that can come forward when we talk about these things, which is, so what are you saying we should do? And actually, so what are you saying we should talk about can have the same trick in it, where the trick is, well, firstly, maybe I'm not saying should anything, but the answer is not going to be the same for everyone. The answer is going to come out of stopping trying to stand above and answer once and for all, and starting being in place and answering for here and for now and for where I am standing and moving within at this moment. And then there are lots of things that need doing, and there are lots of things to talk about. But we might still also need some commonplaces, some boundary objects, some things that we can talk about together, not least when those of us who are working mostly outside big systems and those who are working mostly inside big systems meet. In the book, the answer that I suggest at the end is that it might be helpful to start from talking about loss and longing, because I think it's you know, it's so ubiquitous within experience and so underserved by the languages of modernity, that, you know, if I look at movements that seem to have had power and energy in them in recent times that are utterly, or at least superficially, contradictory or on different sides. You know, I use the example at the end of the book of Extinction Rebellion and the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vests movement in France, which both erupted onto the street on the same day, 17th of November, 2018. It's very striking, this symmetry on both sides of the channel and these two colonial powers. And it's really easy to present that as, you know, the good protesters in the UK protesting against climate change and the bad protesters protesting against fuel tax and getting in the way of tackling climate change in France. But what strikes me is that both of those movements have at their heart an articulation of loss and longing and grief and disorientation, and that it might be in the places where they meet that the potential is, though, also some of the dangers of what is possible now. So I don't know if that's really an answer to.
No, that's a great, a helpful answer, and particularly, yeah, the words loss and longing will stick with me, and as a sort of note to, you know, in thinking about how to have these kind of conversations, and where to start from and what to explore in my own work. And yeah, so thank you.
Thanks. And just to add to that, Black Elephant, which I touched on at the end, part of what they do is bring together groups of 8 or 9 people, either around a dinner table or in a Zoom space, with a couple of questions, where the aim is to have people whose experiences are very different, whose views and positions might be very different, and not talk about that like political or public stuff very much, but have questions that invite everyone to share from their own vulnerability from within their own lives. And there's something very powerful about that, and then potentially the context that emerges on the far side of having met each other in that way, rather than the ways we often meet, that might set the ground for more fruitful conversation.
Dougald, I know you said you have to leave in a moment, and Bayo had another interview and he apologizes that he had to duck out without actually saying thank you. But you know, your conversations are ongoing and this won't be the last of them. Sorry to everybody in the audience, we don't have a time to get to all your questions, but I hope these conversations will continue. And Dougald, do you have anything you'd like to just sort of end with? Any thoughts you wanted to share at the end here? I know you probably have another meeting you have to go to also, so whatever you need, just you have the last word.
Thank you. Well, I feel like I've had a lot of words.
Good ones.
Over the last 2 hours. So maybe we just end with a little silence before we say goodbye.
All right.
Thanks, everyone. It's been really, really good to be with you. And I'm so delighted that this was the first public event in this year of the book for me, that I was able to share it in this context, hosted by you guys, Maya and Athong, and with Bayo and Ciclón as conversation partners. It's just been really delightful to spend this time together.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dougald, once again for your wonderful time with us, and also your knowledge sharing with us together. And also, I would like to extend a heartfelt thanks to Bayo and Ciclón for their time in discussions. Also, our host Maya with us together, and also to all the participants for for participating in the talk and giving your comments and questions. It has been a beautiful event, talk for all of us together. And we wish you a great year ahead. Yeah,
and when Dougald, your book comes out February 9th, right?
Yep, 4 weeks today.
And it will be available, I think, at many booksellers online. So At Work in the Ruins. The ruins. Yes. So yes, let's keep the conversation going, and until the next time, farewell, everyone. Go well. See you guys next time.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Yeah.